Well, good evening, Soundside Church. Pastor Aaron coming to you and to your community group in particular. Tonight, we are looking at Psalm 73. If you've not done so already, make sure that you pause the video, read Psalm 73 out loud in your group, and then come back and let's resume this video. Well, Psalm 73. This is part of our community group series that we're calling How to Talk to God, where we use selected psalms to help shape our prayers and thus our relationship with God. You know, you may have heard the question asked, you might have asked it yourself, why do bad things happen to good people? That's a very common question, I think, in some circles, and there's a really good answer to it that I'm not going to give right now, because I'd like to flip the question around and ask its mirror version. Why do good things happen to bad people? That is a question I find myself asking maybe a little bit more often than the other one. And that could be why I find that Psalm 73 resonates with me so deeply. In fact, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Psalm 73 may be my favorite psalm. Of all of them, Psalm 73 is the one I find my mind drifting back to, I think, more often than any other. I find myself quoting verses from Psalm 73, sometimes during the day, sometimes just in my prayers to God. And I think some of that just has to do with the fact that when I read Psalm 73, I feel like Asaph gets me. Now, who's Asaph? The Psalm 73 title tells us this is a psalm of Asaph. And just really quick detour here to kind of tell you who this guy is. If we go all the way back to when King David wanted to build a temple for God, God told him no, that task was going to be left to his son Solomon. So for the rest of his life, David devoted all of his energy toward making preparations for the temple. And part of that included organizing the music. Now, David, as we understand it, was a musician himself, and so had a lot of interest in that. And so he organized the musical part of the worship of God that would take place at the temple. And of course, he got it started even before the temple was built there at the tabernacle, that temporary structure. And because the Levites were in charge of the worship there at the tabernacle and then later the temple, David selected certain Levites. In fact, the Levites were divided into 3 families, and David picked one guy from each family to head up the music. He picked Heman, who was of the Kohathites. He picked Ethan, also called Jeduthun, who was of the Merarites, and then he picked Asaph, who was of the Gershomites, and these were the 3 families of the Levites. Of the 3 of them, it seems like Asaph was the leader. Each of these men was responsible for recruiting a choir and let's just call it a band, a worship band, from the members of their Levitical family. And that would become the musical group, the worship team that they would oversee. David made musical instruments for them, and these guys would learn to sing, and in fact, it involved writing songs or psalms that they would sing to help the people worship God, and the people would learn the songs and they would all sing these things back to God. And if I say nothing else, I just hope you understand just how truly important a good worship leader is. And we are so thankful for Jason at our church and the leadership that he gives to our worship ministry. Of course, worship is bigger than the music, but music has always been an essential part of worshiping God. Asaph is a great example. Now, Asaph wasn't just a worship leader. The Bible also says he was a prophet. And so we feel that he was very self-consciously writing this psalm and 11 others, actually, because they would encompass God's people's experience of God, and perhaps no more so than Psalm 73. I love what Asaph does here in this psalm. He gives us some incredible images. You know, he does talk about why does good stuff happen to bad people, and it bothers him so much that if bad people are doing so well, what's the point of being good? In his language, what's the point of serving God if the wicked are just going to do fine? And he describes the wicked in the early portions of the psalm. But he gives us this beautiful, powerful image. Look at verse 6, for instance. He says, therefore, pride is their necklace and violence covers them like a garment. Pride and violence are how these people get dressed. Now, I think it's worth saying that violence here doesn't necessarily have to include physical contact, although it can. It simply refers to aggression, to take aggression towards somebody else. These lines are parallel. Pride and violence are parallel to each other. And so we can kind of see the idea here as self-exaltation at the expense of someone else. And if we try to think about where this shows up in our world, we could think about, mean girls leaving comments on Instagram, or we could talk about wealthy people flaunting their wealth in front of people who can't afford it. The idea is these are people who do not mind presenting themselves as people who are willing to put other people down so that they can rise to the top. That image is what Asaph gives us. And we are allowed to think about somebody putting pride on like jewelry and then putting their violence on like a coat, and that's how they go out in public. That's how they present themselves. And according to Asaph, they're doing fine. They're doing fine. But they're not really, are they? Because he keeps going and he says, no, I had to have my thinking reoriented by God. And then I realized, and here's another image, verse 18, indeed, you put them in slippery places. You make them fall into ruin. And all I can picture is a climber stuck on the side of a mountain in the rain, holding tight and not able to get any purchase with his or her feet. They're in a slippery place, and at any moment, they could go plummeting to the ground. Now, that might sound a little morbid, but that's what he sees. He's like, they look like they're doing fine, but they are one wrong step away from disaster. That's what these images do. They conjure up our imagination so that we can see things with different eyes. And that imagery is part of what makes this poetry. In a previous video, we talked about how parallelism is part of Hebrew poetry in the Bible. The other part of poetry are images like this. And so when we see images like this, we know we're reading poetry and we start interpreting things poetically. So for instance, we get to verse 11, and he describes wicked people in these terms. The wicked say, how can God know? Does the Most High know everything? Well, I don't know how many people actually say that. I don't know how many wicked people say, does God know what I'm doing? Most people who have any knowledge of God would not imagine that God doesn't know that. So I don't know that anybody actually says this. Maybe somebody did. But the larger idea, because it's poetry, the larger idea is that there are people who behave and speak as if God doesn't know, or as if they don't care about what God thinks about what they're doing or what they're saying. Again, the poetry helps us to enlarge it and see through Asaph's eyes the world we live in and interpret things that way. Now, I want to be very careful about one thing. Asaph is talking about really, really bad people. And we may not encounter really bad people like the ones he's describing. However, the struggle is the same. Whether we're talking about bullying students in school, or we're talking about an unethical employer, or we're talking about actual crooks and villains and murderers and kidnappers, whether we're talking about the one or the other, the struggle is still the same. Why do these people seem to be getting ahead while those who serve God seem to be falling behind? That's his struggle in verse 13. Did I purify my heart? Did I wash my hands in innocence for nothing? If people who don't know Jesus are doing fine, why would I give my life to Jesus? Asaph, But what Psalm 73 teaches us is that when we pray, we can pray our honest feelings and questions to God. Now, sometimes these things are better done privately. Verse 15, Asaph does say, if I had voiced my questions, I would have betrayed people. I might have led people astray. So I'm going to talk these to God. You're like, but he just wrote them publicly. I know, because he finished the psalm. Okay, he finished the psalm. But like I said, some of these things are better done privately until we can get God's perspective. And that's what he does. He takes the honest feelings and questions, works through them. He gets to the other side. When he goes into God's sanctuary, or as we might put it, he sees things from God's perspective. Then he understands what he's looking at. Then he realizes what he really has. It looks like they've got it all and I've got nothing. But when I enter God's sanctuary, his holy place, his temple, when I see things from his perspective, I realize what I have is far, far better. And he discusses that at the end of the psalm, verses 23 through 28, and kind of reminds me of Ephesians chapters 1 and 2, where Paul says, I pray that God would open the eyes of your heart so that you can see the hope of his calling and understand the wealth of your inheritance in Christ and the incredible power that is working in you right now. What you've got is incredible. You just can't see it. And that's what Asaph does. He helps us to see it. And he gets us to the end where we find that verses 25 and 26, I believe, are some of the most precious verses in all the Bible. They can be lifted right off the page and prayed directly to God. And I kind of think that all of our praying, all of the Psalms help us to pray ourselves into the place where we can say with Asaph, who do I have in heaven but you? And I desire nothing on earth but you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. We're going to have some questions for you to work through Psalm 73. And I hope as you do that you'll find yourself in that exact same place saying, who do I have in heaven but you? There's none upon earth I desire beside you. Psalm 73. I hope you come to love and appreciate it as I have, and that it shapes our prayers. I'll turn things over to your community group leader now.